Okay, students, today we're going to talk about how to do introductions. Again, I have something wrong with my PowerPoint. Just introductions today. We'll go over conclusions later on. And just kind of like our presentation on paragraphs, some of this you have heard before. In fact, I assume you have. This is kind of a reminder for what paragraphs look like. Maybe you haven't heard that though. Heard this though, and that's okay. Hopefully this is helpful either way. These are just some ways that your teachers will expect your introductions to look like in an academic setting. And in general, they're pretty good writing practices in other settings as well, though it depends on the genre, of course. So in an introduction, the whole purpose of the introduction basically is to introduce your topic and make your reader want to continue reading. So, and then I guess in the third thing that you want to do is make sure you set up the paper for what they can expect, okay? So those are pretty specific things that you want to do, and because of that, there's really three specific sentences that you want to have within that. And I thought that was the next PowerPoint, but apparently it's not. So those next those three things that you should have, I'm just going to add them right now. You want to have a hook that engages your reader. You want to have what's called a context sentence, and that's going to give your reader some information. That's the beginning of setting up your topic. And then you want to have a thesis, or basically the stance or the way you want to organize that specific paper that you're going to do, okay? All right, so a good introduction is going to set the plan for good writing, and it will vary by genre, but keep in mind most of the sort of overall genres that we're writing in here are going to be academic, within the academic umbrella, so this should work for all of that kind of writing. Okay, now there are a couple strategies, specific strategies that you want to use when you're setting up your hook for your introduction. So you've probably seen these, or maybe you've seen these somewhere. These are the couple things that you can do. I'm going to introduce and show examples of how you would use these in your academic writing. And just because I wanted to give some context, didn't want to keep reinventing the wheel, I'm going to act like I'm doing some sort of text analysis on the novel A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And just to give you some idea of what that's about, so this makes some sense. This is a book that talks about sort of an imaginary conversation that Virginia Woolf has with someone who asks her, what do women need to be good writers, essentially? How can we support women writers? Okay. So one of the strategies you can use is to have an anecdote. An anecdote is another word for story. So some sort of story. This can be a personal story. It can be, you can be retelling something like a fable or some folktale from another culture. I don't know what another culture is, but some sort of story that maybe is popular somewhere, right? And you can tell that in your own words. You can also have it as it comes from your experience. So in this one, I'm telling a story about a friend I have who, you know, was having kind of a low moment and felt like she just wasn't really much appreciated, I guess, or didn't have much value. And saying, you know, that's kind of crazy, right? And then that's my hook here, is this story up here. And then this is really the context here. So I'm going to say how this woman could feel like nothing was to me a sad reflection of society. And in that, I'm going to lead into my thesis, and one Virginia Woolf gives the reader a new perspective on in her acclaimed novel, A Room of One's Own. I would probably, if I was going to write this an actual paper, I would have a specific statement after here that would be my my thesis. But this is an example of why you need that context, because this story up here really doesn't have much to do with what I'm going to talk about in my paper. I mean, it does, but it's sort of jarring unless you have that connecting sentence that helps you understand the connection between them. So that's the importance of the context sentence. Okay, so another way you can introduce a paper is you can ask some some sort of provocative question. So what if Shakespeare had a sister? Because that gets your reader thinking about, oh, what if he did have a sister? And, what would that mean, right? So it can get your reader not only thinking about your topic, but also engaged and interested about your topic. You do need to be kind of careful that this is, it is a provocative question, just not a general question. Sometimes those can get a little trite if you just have like, what is reading? Blah, 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 right? It needs to be some sort of thought put into that makes it more interesting. Okay, now you will see conflicting messages about this, but you can have a definition. Now, the conflicting thing that you will see is some people will say, no, don't ever start with a definition. What they mean is do not ever start with Merriam-Webster says in the dictionary that women is really this, and you give the definition or whatever term you pick, right? What you can do is you can introduce a term and explain it in your own words. So a room is just a space in which you do things you find important. And you could go on to talk about there are rooms like this and there are rooms like that, go on to talk about this idea. So you can talk about a topic, under giving your reader an understanding of a specific word. You just don't want to say the dictionary says, right? Okay, another thing you can do is make a historical comparison. So the book A Room of One's Own, it came around, not the same exact time, but it was about the same time as the Votes for Women. So that was the easy historical comparison I made. So in 1921, after years and even decades of hard work, the suffragettes across the country, women finally won the right to vote. It is not surprising then that a measly 8 years later, the question of how and when society will allow women to contribute to the society is addressed in A Room of One's Own. Okay, so again, I'm giving some hook like, oh, okay, we're going to talk about suffragettes. This is getting a reader engaged, right? And I'm connecting that idea of the suffragettes to the specific topic I'm going to talk about, which is A Room of One's Own, okay? And then this, I assume, is my thesis. Women want to contribute to society and more than just government policies. Okay, another thing you can do is connect it with some sort of current event. So, the obvious one for me that stood out because this was about women's rights, the current, high topic women's rights issue is the Me Too movement. And I could talk about what that means, today for women and compare it to what that meant for Virginia Woolf, right? Another thing you can do is add a statistic. And like the definition, you really need to be careful about this one. You want to explain it in a way that's engaging and not sort of rote and robotic, right? So, and you also want to make sure you give your reader a good idea of where you got your statistic from. So, in her thought-provoking 2019 book, Invisible Women, Caroline Criado Perez shared the following statistic, and then I give the statistic. And then I'm going to tie that to what I'm going to talk about. 100 years before Caroline published this book, Virginia Woolf talked about the same phenomenon in her novel. And again, the connection here is that, they're both talking about how women are perceived and maybe the obstacles that come in their way. And I'm trying to make that clear. Obviously, all of these could be more refined than that one, definitely. But that's the idea, is you're trying to give more... you're trying to give a statistic that gets them thinking about it, your topic, and yeah. All right, vivid description. So, long pearl necklaces, black patent Mary Janes, and exquisite flapper dresses adorned the women of Virginia Woolf's day, but notably missing were titles, graduation cords, and the important-looking briefcases carried by men. Missing too are the access to education and the financial security that an education would bring. So in this instance, I decided to talk about the women's fashion of the day and compare it to sort of some of the notable things that were missing that were in men's ability to wear. This one's just kind of up to you, and you're thinking of like, what could you describe that would get your reader interested in your topic? And that could be a lot of different things, but that's the one that I thought of for this one. Okay, another thing you can do is bring in a metaphor. Now, this can be a really great way to write a paper, but can be a little tricky. So this one I compared women to pretty birds in a gilded cage. The idea being that they're beautiful to look at, but they're not free to roam around and do their own thing. Now, if I were to do this in a paper, I would want to not just throw it in and move on. Probably, if I did this, I would connect to this throughout the paper. Definitely, I would connect to it in the introduction and the conclusion. And I'll say that for all of these strategies. If you're going to bring them up in the introduction, then you want to tie back to it somehow in the conclusion. Otherwise, your reader's like, no, wait, what does that have to do with the thing that you brought up at the beginning? And it just kind of ties it all together really nicely. Okay, another thing you can do is have a concession, which means like you're going to consider the opposing side right away. So, there is actually a movement called the men's rights movement. They have good things to say too. So I thought I'd bring that one up in this introduction. And again, this is kind of thinking about, okay, coming back to Room of One's Own, how can I connect this hook, this engagement that helps people want to keep reading to what I'm going to talk about. Okay? And it shouldn't be just like totally out of nowhere. But again, the idea is to get the reader excited and interested in your topic. Okay, another thing you can do is background information. Now, because I'm doing this about a novel, then an easy one to do background information would be the author of the novel. So I give some information here. You could also give background information about your topic, about the history behind it, maybe some context around whatever you're talking about. But that would be just to sort of explain a little bit about it in this introduction. Intriguing example. So, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was an instant success, the Harry Potter of its day. She would spend much of the next decade traveling throughout the American continent, delivering speeches to gathering crowds, though because she was a woman, she would not deliver these herself. She would instead wait in the galley as her husband delivered the speech. This literal distancing of women from the educated circles of the day is something Virginia Woolf would later poignantly address in A Room of One's Own. Okay. So I do this a lot where I bring in this whole introduction and then I say, and this is something Virginia Woolf talks about, right? And that's an easy way to do context. The other thing that I would say about this one and about many of the other examples I've included here, I had to do a little bit of research to understand how to include this, and that's okay. I think initially I actually did know about this because of some research I'd done for something else, but I had to go back and kind of look it up and figure it out. And again, this is me, this is me just kind of thinking through what would be an example of the topic that I'm trying to talk about, right? So there is a lot of kind of thought work going into these. Puzzling scenario, the easy one for this is just, women are limited, and Virginia Woolf's going to talk about that in her book, right? All right, so that's all I have for the introductions. Like the main thing though, I want to go back to this slide that I threw in at the last minute here. For any of your introductions, you're going to want to make sure you have a hook that is meant to engage the reader, and you want to connect that hook with a sentence or half a sentence sometimes, or maybe 2 or 3 sentences to the thesis, and that's the main idea you're sharing in your paper. Okay, so those 3 things should be in every introduction that you have. All right, let me know if you have questions.